Hello, everyone. It's a solo episode this week on the I Have No Idea What I'm Doing podcast, a show that helps African women at the start of their entrepreneurship journey reach their business, money, and life goals faster. I'm your host, Paula, checking in from Nairobi, Kenya, and welcome. So this episode is a little different from the usual because I'm going to be talking about my podcast journey. I get asked a lot about podcasting, given my work founding two companies in the African podcasting space, Africa Podfest and Kali Media. So many of you out there want to start your own podcast and just really don't know where to begin. So I wanted to put together a special episode just for you, mainly to show you that you too can start your own podcast and enjoy the benefits of podcasting. Because let me tell you, I have been where you are right now. Full disclosure before I go on, I am teaching a webinar for aspiring podcasters this week. It's especially for those of you who have been thinking about starting a podcast for a while, but then for whatever reason have yet to start. And I want to tell you that it's normal for it to be a struggle to start a podcast. There's nothing wrong with you, and hopefully my podcast journey will show you that. And in many ways, my podcast journey is similar to any entrepreneurial journey because there's so many ups and downs. So this is relevant even for those of you who are not interested in podcasting. Also, please forgive the sound quality of this episode. I have some construction happening in my home today, and I don't have the time to wait for them to finish because I just have too many other things going on today. So please forgive any background noise, whether it's a bump or it's traffic. I'm not in my usual recording location, but this will have to do today. Better to get it done than to get it perfect. All right, so let's jump into my podcast journey. So the earliest memory of my podcast is in 2016, so about 4 years ago. And I'm still not even sure I remember how the idea first came to me. I just know it was in 2016. And it was around the time that I was ready to leave my full-time job as an editor in Boston, Massachusetts, and move back home to Kenya. So that was in 2016. And as with all initial ideas, it came around a time of a lot of transition. So forgive me, I'm a little blurry about how it came about exactly. And I say that because my first interview for the podcast actually happened in 2017, long before I had really figured out what the podcast was going to be about. The interview was with Pat Okello. And for those of you who are regular listeners, Pat has been interviewed in episode 15, but she was also on episode 5.5 if you go back into my archives. And when I was interviewing her, she had just come out with her book, A Candid Handbook for Women Doing Business in Kenya. So at this time, I was still in the US and I was trying to research how to start a business in Kenya. And as you can guess, the results were terrible. So suddenly here this book comes, it's Pat's book, and it was such a godsend. However, there was no digital version of the book. I emailed Pat and asked her if she could please send me some form of a digital version that I was ready to pay for. And she was so kind enough to actually send me a physical copy of the book. And after that, I interviewed her on Skype. It was a really great interview, and I am forever grateful for Pat for her willingness to talk to me. But let me tell you, the audio from that interview was so bad. It was terrible. And I was so discouraged. I could not keep going. And that's why my first interview with her on the podcast is a mini episode. It's because I could barely use any of that audio. So here I am. I've done my first interview and it's not done well. And it was enough to discourage me to stop. That was 2017. So in early 2018, I finally moved back to Kenya. I figured out how I was going to move back home. And I had a much clearer idea about the podcast, as well as my own company, Kali Media. So I moved home to start Kali Media, which is a company that creates content specifically for East African women. And by this point, I had done some market research about my audience and who I wanted to reach. And part of that research told me that I wanted to create something around podcasting for women, not just with my own podcast. So I wanted to create something called Kali Pods, which would be a podcast network specifically made for and by East African women. All the subject matter, all the hosts would be women from this side of the world. But at the time, I wasn't sure because podcasting in 2018 was nothing like it is now in Kenya, let alone in Africa. Today, at least in Kenya, it feels like everyone is podcasting. It's exciting, it's sexy, people know what it is. But between 2017 and 2018, those who were podcasting back then know it was a tough place. It was the kind of thing where people were still asking, what is a podcast? And not that that's different today. There's still a few people asking that, but there's barely places I go today where people don't at least know what a podcast is. So here I am. I want to create a podcast network, but I actually need to know if podcasting could work. I needed to test the waters. And the only way I could do that was to release a podcast. And the cheapest way for me to create a podcast was for myself. I'm usually on the production side of things, so it was very difficult for me to decide that I needed to be a host of my own podcast. But when it came down to budget and time and ease, it made a lot of sense. That's when the idea for I have no idea what I'm doing came back to life. So let me describe to you what I was going through at this time. First of all, I was launching a company with very little knowledge about the media industry here and even the country and the region. I'd been away from Kenya for a really long time, and I needed intimate knowledge about it in order to do the work I wanted to do. I also didn't really know much about business. I'm a journalist, and so I was struggling with that. And then I wanted to create this podcast network, but I didn't really know how to. Was the market really ready? There was a lot going on. But I at least knew I could start with this podcast. So this is around February 2018. And I made the decision, I'm going to go ahead and do this. No more doubting myself. And there's something about deciding to do something because the universe responds. And the response from the universe was Halima Gikandi. Halima ended up becoming my producer for the first season of the podcast and one of the most instrumental people I've met around podcasting. I met her because she reached out to me actually. She's also Kenyan American, but she had just moved to Kenya to report, to be a journalist. And we met because she had been an intern at a former employer of mine. And when they heard she was moving to Kenya, they recommended that she reach out to me when she arrived. So I remember this day really well. We met at a Java in town, and the conversation was mostly about me giving her journalism advice. But then in that conversation, I happened to find out that she had radio experience and audio production experience. And so I offered her at that point the position of my producer of this podcast that had not even been fully formed. And let me tell you, this was a game changer. Having Halima around as a producer was really important. She was a soundboard in many ways, and a lot of that great production you hear in season 1 is her work. But the key thing about her role, I think for me with the podcast, was that she was an accountability partner. I really think the only reason the podcast made it to the finish line is because she was there to hold me accountable. And so we started working together. And the premise of the first season was to share everything a female entrepreneur in East Africa needs to know to successfully launch her business in the first year. Why did we go that direction? it was an opportunity for me to talk to other women about what I personally needed to know in my first year of business. Remember, I told you I knew nothing, and here I was trying to start a media company. And, the information that was out there was not really specific to Kenya and not really specific to media and not really specific to me being a woman. It was really weird to navigate that. So I had all these amazing women come and interview for season 1, from Shefo Okore, who was in episode 1 and set the tone for this whole podcast, to June Goshui in episode 3, who talked to me about the legal aspect of my company, what it takes to register it, and more. That's really one of the best episodes out there for any new entrepreneur. And then there was the money episode with Andia Chakava, episode number 5. I remember this so well because I was so scared to talk to her about money. And I researched and practiced my questions. I was so nervous. And really, that episode, for those of you who are regular listeners, was really the first inkling of the Money Matters series. For those of you who are not regular listeners, the Money Matters episodes is a series I do once a month where I just talk about women and money and financial literacy. And that interview with Andia Chakava in 2018 was really the beginning stages of this series. Between February and October 2018, Halima and I put together the podcast. We came up with a concept. We then came up with episodes. We recorded at None on Record, which is now AQ Studios in Westlands, before switching over to recording at Mojo Productions, which is on Lenana Road. I found Jopi the chef, who did my theme song. My friend Deborah Cartwright, who's an amazing illustrator, helped me come up with the illustration for my podcast. And then, Halima and I worked weekends. We would work at the Java in Upper Hill all day. They knew us really well. And eventually we pulled something together. Finally, in November 2018, we launched the podcast. So remember, my idea first came to me in 2016. This is almost 3 years later. And again, I talk about Halima and accountability because the week before we launched was scary. I had all the feelings. I had thoughts like, who would listen? Why would they even listen? Why would they care? I had thoughts about me being too American and being inaccessible. No one is really interested. My voice sounds weird. No one even listens to podcasts. But I remember Halima really pushing me through, and even all the women that I interviewed were really enthusiastic and encouraging for me to finish this project. So we launched, and it was such a big lead up. This is what's gonna happen. We're gonna launch. The first trailer dropped, and then the episode dropped to 0 listeners. Guys, no one was listening. And it's from there that I learned about audience development and how you have to market your podcast to reach new people. And that was a new skill that I had to learn. But of course, eventually, people started listening. Some of you are listeners all the way from season 1. Now, for those of you who've gone back to listen, you'll notice that the first season was meant to be just that, 1 season. I have no idea what I'm doing was meant to be a limited series podcast because I never really wanted to host my own show. Remember, number 1, I wanted to help other women create podcasts. Number 2, I was testing to see if podcasting could be a thing. And number 3, I wanted to learn how to start my own company by interviewing these other women. Nowhere in that were there ideals or interests in me being a podcast host. The intention was never really about the podcast being a longer term project. Well, until I recorded my final episode with Halima. I think then I knew I wanted to continue, but I wasn't sure if I could even bring it back again. And then there was the response after I started, marketing the podcast. I would receive messages from other women who said thank you and who were excited to go find a place specifically for them about business. There's something about hearing from your audience and hearing that feedback that just really feeds you. But even despite this, it took another 1.5 years for me to come back and relaunch the podcast this past July. And that was mostly due to COVID. I had more time on my hands and I could sit down and record. But a lot of things were happening in the in-between, in that 1.5 years. Remember, I put the podcast out also as a way to test the podcasting waters, if there was a market. The feedback showed me that the market was not big enough for me to invest in Kali pods. But also, I couldn't just sit and wait for it to be ready. I needed to create something. I needed to create something that helped the promotion of podcasting in Kenya and in Africa. And for those of you who know that Toni Morrison quote, there's a quote she has that goes, "If there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." And so the book I wrote, or in this case, the company I created, was Africa Podfest, which was the continent's first podcast festival. And the goal was to bring podcasters in Kenya and from all over the continent, as well as other members of the podcasting ecosystem, into one room to legitimize, to validate the fact that podcasting can really do great things in Africa. And with Podfest, I was able to consider podcasting outside of Kenya and East Africa. You see, I was looking at podcasting from a global perspective. The opportunities for podcasting in Africa are unmatched. And once we figure that out, once we figure out what the formula is specific to us and stop copying what the West is doing, the places we could go with podcasting are immense. But it was also time-consuming and grueling and taxing work. So when I finally returned to relaunch the podcast, having stepped away and seen podcasting in this sort of bigger global perspective, I knew what I wanted out of the podcast. First of all, I decided that I would produce it myself and I would change the format to interviewing women entrepreneurs while also sharing my own lessons as an entrepreneur. But my decision to switch up the format of the podcast is why season 1 and 2 are as different as they are. They're essentially 2 different shows. And I assume season 3, which I'm planning for right now, will also continue to evolve the show. But what I am proud to say is that I produce every single aspect of this show today. From booking guests, to interviewing them, to editing, to uploading, to the social media, I do all that work. I no longer use a studio or an editor, and it's a lot of work, but it's so worth it. I know for season 1, the episodes were exclusively edited by Halima. Halima went on to be an amazing journalist. You can actually find her on PRX The World. She is a great, great, great audio producer and journalist. And we're still really good friends. I will say that when I launched for the second time in July, I was very scared that no one would come back. When I'd look at the stats of the podcast, there'd be listens here and there. But it had been 1.5 years. I lost a lot of my audience. So for those of you who did come back, thank you. Thank you for coming back and validating the work that I do. I truly appreciate you. So that's my podcasting journey between 2016 and 2020. But I wanted to share some of the lessons I learned in my journey. Some quick lessons. Number 1, it takes a while to find your groove. Even now, as I work on this podcast, I'm still figuring out what I'm doing. I'm adding things, I'm changing things. If you're an astute listener, even how I describe the podcast has changed over the last few episodes. I'm trying and testing things and experimenting, and that's really some of the fun parts about podcasting. The second thing is you need to get people who can help you get to the finish line. I mentioned some names, including Halima, but even all the guests I talked to really helped me cross the finish line. I had a friend who worked on my illustration for my logo. I worked with a musician. Really reach out to people who can help you. And sometimes people are willing to do it for free, so just consider that. And more than anything else, look out for people who can be your accountability partner, because you will get in your head and that will prevent you from starting. So that's really important. The third thing is you'll either spend time or you'll spend money. Something has to be spent. So with the first season, I spent more money. And I went through the process much faster than I do now. Each episode takes about 24 hours for me to pull together from start to finish. That's a lot of time. But it would be much faster if I could just sort of send it off to an editor, or if I went to a studio, or if I had an assistant who was pulling together all the guests. So you'll either spend time or you'll spend money. And depending on what your time budget is and your money budget is will decide what you'll end up doing. The fourth thing is just start. I've had so many stops and starts with this podcast. I have launched twice, so just do it. Number 5, it's okay if you drop off. Just keep coming back if you can. There's something to be said about consistency. If you can be as consistent as possible, please do that. If you need to fall off, end the season before you fall off, because people expect things from you and they build a rapport with you around your consistency. But if you do fall off, don't disallow yourself from coming back, because you can come back. Number 6, no one will be listening in the beginning. Don't be discouraged. Of course, your mother will listen. Your best friends will listen. People in your circle will listen to maybe one episode because it might not necessarily be their cup of tea. But keep going. The more you go, the more listeners will eventually pick up. I'm now at this stage where every time I get a new listener, they're going into the archives and listening to the other episodes, and I don't even think my archive is that big. So just keep going, keep building. Don't be discouraged. Number 7, show up consistently. I've already talked about consistency, but if you're doing this, learn to make the commitment and show up consistently. My podcast comes out every Tuesday. It might not come out every Tuesday at the same time, but you will be guaranteed that you're going to get something on a Tuesday. And finally, my last lesson is you can change your mind. I've changed my mind about this podcast many times. And of course, I want to try stay as consistent as possible. But as I grow, the podcast also grows, and there's new lessons and there's new things I want to add. The Money Matters series is so important to me because I've found new inspiration around financial literacy, and I know how much it matters to me and my business and my life. And so I know, because I am also one of the consumers of my podcast, I know my audience would also appreciate it. And so money has now become a key part of the podcast. I'm allowed to change, and you're also allowed to change. So that's my podcast story. I am now about 24 episodes in, with about 1,200 downloads a month, with listeners from all over the world. I'm not the type to do extreme promotion because I really enjoy, first of all, because I don't have time, but also I really enjoy this corner of the world that's just mine and my listeners. And most of the growth is through word of mouth. So if you're here, sometimes it's because someone else told you about it, and I like that. I continue to learn and grow with my podcast, and one day I'm really excited when I bring Kali Pods to fruition, to its fullest realization. And maybe you'll be one of the podcasts or one of the podcasters that I one day work with in Kali Pods. So that's my podcast journey. I'm going to jump in and talk to you about my webinar. that I talked about earlier in the episode. This webinar, like I said, is for aspiring podcasters who, for whatever reason, have yet to start. Maybe some of the feelings and hang-ups that I mentioned from my journey have affected you. It could be lack of confidence. It could be the fact that my audio was terrible when I first started recording. It could be that I had to switch studios. It could be that I struggled to find a producer. It could be all these many things. The fact that no one listened in the beginning. All of those things happened to me, and those things are really normal. This webinar is for you because I get to talk about some of these hang-ups and also share solutions. So my webinar is for you. It's called The 5 Most Common Pitfalls Preventing You from Launching Your Podcast, plus the strategies on how to overcome them. Some of these are from my own personal experience, but also because of the work I do with Africa Podfest and Kali Media, I meet a lot of podcasters and they tell me why they haven't started their podcast or the things that they're struggling with. So I'm very intimate with knowing what is stopping people from starting. So in this masterclass, or this webinar, but I'm calling it a masterclass, you learn the 5 reasons you probably haven't started your podcast, and I'm sure at least one of them will apply to you. You learn the things you can do to overcome these reasons and really get you on track to starting. And then there's a bonus in there. We're going to do an exercise around brainstorming your podcast idea and brainstorming for your first few episodes. So that will be really fun. So that is happening this week, the week of September 14th, 2020. I'm offering the webinar twice. The first one will be on Wednesday, September 16th at 6 p.m. East Africa time, which is GMT +3 for those of you who are foreign listeners, or Thursday, September 17th at 9 p.m. East Africa time. You can go ahead and sign up in the link that will be in the show notes. And I promise you that if you come and commit and listen, I will really show you how to get past whatever is holding you back from creating your podcast. Got it? Great. I'm excited to see you at the masterclass. And that's it for this week. We're back with a Money Matters episode next week. Really excited about that. So be it. See to it. Have a great week.